Everyone, welcome back. This is week 6, lecture 1, and there is actually no lecture 2 in week 6 because we'll be starting our spring break. Hooray! In the middle of this week. So after this lecture, there will be about a week and a half break from additional lectures, and you won't have any work to do over the break other than continuing to work on your object paper. And there will be a short response, but you don't technically have to work on this during break. You can work on it other times. So no real work during break unless you're feeling behind on the object paper. That'd be the only thing I would say you need to do. Or if you're behind on the readings, you can do some catch up. So break is a good time to catch up. If you're already caught up, congratulations, enjoy your break. Today, I'm going to be building on the textbook, Chapter 9. I assigned page 190 to 205 and 209 to 211, which is kind of the wrapping it up section of that chapter. And I'm going to be building out on some of the stuff the textbook talks to you about, especially in terms of the Warring States or Spring and Autumn period, the schools, 100 schools of thought, kind of early Chinese philosophy, and statehood, and also the first emperor and the first empire under the Qin. I'm not going to talk too much about the Han that follow. The book talks about the Han kind of extensively for a few pages at least. And so my focus here will be mostly on the pre-Han, the Qin, and the 100 schools of thought before it. Questions I want to tackle today is what is Confucianism and where did it come from? We have Confucius here on the right, one rendering of him. This is, of course, a much more recent painting. This is a rather famous one. You see this one a lot. Now I want to talk about who the intended audience was for Confucianism and the other schools of thought, because Confucianism is really one of multiple schools of thought that were operating in ancient China and also kind of competing with one another. And to get to that, we'll talk about the political background of Chinese philosophy, which is kind of why they're competing. And we will examine a little bit the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi, which I've told you is my favorite of all the tombs. I am biased, but it's quite an excellent tomb, which is on the scale of the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the Mayan pyramids or any of these the keyhole tombs in Japan. It's on the scale of these great tombs, and it happens to be the one that I find the most interesting and kind of just the coolest myself, the coolest tomb according to Kevin. And I'll get my face out of the way here as we get started. And there's a lot to cover when we talk about Chinese philosophy. I don't want you to feel like you have to memorize all these things, but I do feel like a little bit more detail, a little bit more information than the book gives you could be helpful, because Chinese philosophy from the ancient period, from the Warring States period, during the decline of the Zhou, is really foundational and still relevant even to modern China and modern Asia as a whole. This includes East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, those two areas. India has less relationship to Chinese philosophy. Obviously, as we've learned, India has its own sets of philosophies, but Chinese philosophy really comes to predominate East Asia and Southeast Asia, where in Southeast Asia it's competing a little bit with Indian philosophy, and it does that in China, Korea, and Japan as well. But to understand Chinese philosophy is to understand a lot of Asian history. So today what we're really talking about, I'm bringing back, I'll bring back this dynastic timeline now and then because I think it's just very helpful to have. Today what we're talking about is really what's called the Spring and Autumn and the Warring States periods, and these are, and also the Qin dynasty, and these are the periods in which Chinese philosophy in its roots really starts to form. Returning quickly to the Zhou dynasty where we left off in China in week 2, this big purple blob on the left is kind of deceptive. this area that is the Zhou dynasty, because this is the Western Zhou. So for a few hundred years, the dynasty looks kind of roughly like this. But this is really the height of the Zhou dynasty. And then we have a longer period, the Eastern Zhou, of about 500 years, 450 years, where the Zhou Empire fragmented into multiple states that were competing with one another for power, the Zhou being just one of them. And this is really the political atmosphere in which Chinese philosophy originates. So Chinese philosophy, in its origin, is a large number of competing ideas being promulgated by these great thinkers, these philosophers, um, who are basically shopping their ideas around to the heads of these small states in the former Zhou dynasty. Um, so Chinese philosophy is different than the kind of Hindu or Buddhist philosophy we were looking at last time in some ways, in that it is much less concerned with the individual and with getting to a state of individual nirvana, and more concerned with how to run a society, how to run a state. Um, if you look at someone like Ashoka, the king from Egypt, the emperor from Egypt, or not Egypt, I'm sorry, from India, who was really the one who was responsible for spreading Buddhism throughout India. Um, he is the kind of person that Chinese philosophers were appealing to, trying to gain the favor of, so that a similar thing might happen with their philosophy. Now, they didn't really know about all of this yet. Buddhism doesn't show up in China until after this period, until roughly the first century CE. But it is a similar parallel in that the hope of many of these philosophers is that they will become the advisors to emperors or kings of these Chinese states, and that their philosophies will be the way that the country or the state is run. The mandate of heaven is partially responsible for why we see a lot of this churn, a lot of this rising and falling of small states over time, and also the kind of falling apart of the Zhou. Because as we remember, the Zhou justified their takeover from the Shang by the creation of this mandate of heaven that says, if good things are happening in my empire, that means I belong in power, and it's at least in part because heaven approves of me. If bad things are happening, that means I've lost the mandate of heaven, and so a revolution might come and knock me out of power. So these schools of Chinese philosophy, these new schools, they're new for their time, are being leveraged, being used to try to hold on to power and justify rule, to say the mandate of heaven favors me and my policies, which are based on Confucianism or Taoism or legalism or Mohism, etc. And there are multiple schools, several dozen. I mean, it's called the time of 100 schools of thought, but several dozen really prominent ones. And we're going to talk about 4 or 5 of the really, really big ones today. And so this map is quite useful because it shows the Zhou dynasty as the kind of shattered reality that it was for about a 500-year period, in which the Zhou is just right here in the middle, right? It's actually fairly small. It is in the core. And then there are a number of other states that are competing with one another militarily, politically, economically, for control of the former region that was, under Zhou power for several hundred years earlier on. So this chaotic time sees the birth of Confucianism, which is, I think, undisputably the most significant to Chinese history, but also Taoism, which is quite important even today, legalism, which is the founding political philosophy of the Qin dynasty, which will reunify basically the former Zhou territory and expand it, and the Qin state being over here to the west. Mohism, which is kind of complicated, we'll get into it, a rational, almost scientific view of rule. and militarism, which I'm not really going to talk about, but you may have heard of under people like Sun Tzu and the art of war. I'm not going to talk about that one today because it is not as significant early on, at least to this at this course's kind of broader level as Confucianism, Taoism, legalism are. Mohism and militarism will kind of not really focus on too much. As I said earlier, Buddhism arrives later, around the 1st century CE, and it arrives through Central Asia and by water, by sea routes. But everything we're talking about today predates Buddhism in China. So we're kind of catching up. The 100 schools of thought kind of still going today in some ways. Confucianism is really popularized under the Han Dynasty, the one that comes after the Qin Dynasty, which is, almost 300 years after Confucius's death. So Confucianism in the time of Confucius doesn't really go anywhere. Confucius tries to share his ideas with multiple rulers. Some of them try to employ some of it, and it doesn't really work out for them. And ultimately, the ideas of Confucius are seen as not practical for the time. But let's go ahead and talk about the ideals here first. Confucianism emphasizes, number one, probably the most important thing it's emphasizing is proper actions in the people are inspired by proper actions from the leaders. So if you want a good populace, you should be a good leader. This is a very appealing sense or idea even now. Inferiors should obey their superiors, and there are 5 key relationships for this. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And you'll notice in some of these philosophies, there are regularly similar numbers that come out. We have 5 relationships under Confucius. We'll have 5 elements under Taoism. We see 10 commandments or 10 decrees under multiple philosophical schools. This is different from the Christian 10 commandments, 10 decrees or 10 ideals. But you do see these numbers kind of repeating themselves, but 5 is an important number, an auspicious number, and there are 5 relationships you have to observe and fit into properly under Confucianism. Civil service under Confucius is considered something that you should have because you're good at it, not because you're born into it. You shouldn't be born into great power. You should have great skill that gives you that power. And if you want to retain that power, you should have people around you who are there because of their abilities, not because of their birth. So if you're a king, yes, you're probably going to have your son take over after you die, but you're not going to have every single person in your administration be a family relative who is, there just because they have the same, they share a bloodline with you, the same relatives as you. Instead, you should surround yourself with really competent people. This is a very important idea. It seems very practical to us now, but this is a very important part of Confucianism that is a new development, a new idea that is significant to talk to a king and say, hey, you shouldn't just have all your brothers, sisters, father, mother as all your advisors. You should probably get someone who knows something about how to run an economy, how to run a state, how to fight a war if you need to. You should probably have someone who understands all these things in charge of those things. Confucius famously believes that people are generally good. So you're a fairly good person by nature, but you can be corrupted by bad rulers. So if you have a king who is an evil king, you may yourself become evil under him. And you may be put into bad circumstances by the politicians or rulers above you, whose policies may force you to do things like stealing or killing to survive. This is essentially the opposite of some other people that we're going to look at today, like Shunzi and, importantly, Han Feizi, who is a legalist founder. And Han Feizi is one of the most influential philosophers in setting up the Qin dynasty under Qin Shi Huangdi, which is this first unifying dynasty that we talked about a minute ago, the Qin here. So legalism the opposite of Confucianism, actually catches on first, opposite in at least some ways. Taoism is more complex and difficult to explain than the others on this slide. It has a lot to do with harmony with nature, and the 5 elements are key here, which are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. The concept of yin and yang, which you're probably familiar with, and I'll have on a slide in a minute, emerges from Taoism in approaching all things with a dual nature. And Taoism often stresses through the works of Lao Tzu, who we'll get to, may or may not be a real person, probably a group of people with shared ideas create this image of a philosopher in Lao Tzu. But Lao Tzu promotes rule through non-action. I'll get to what that means in a minute, but it kind of generally just means don't meddle too much in the world around you. And then legalism. Legalism says people are inherently selfish and even evil or bad, and that rulers are the ones who create order, who civilize these people through strict law and its enforcement, strict punishment and strict laws. So punishments should be strict because that will mean people are afraid to commit crimes or do bad deeds, and you will kind of curtail the evil in their brains and in their hearts. So these are kind of not all opposite of each other. Taoism and Confucianism can get along pretty well, but legalism and Confucianism are fairly opposite in some significant ways. Taoism, to add another note, it is the closest and most recognizable today as something that has some religious elements, although Confucianism and legalism do as well in the form of ancestor worship. So all of these have both a political and a religious component, the religious component perhaps being more obvious and more clear in Taoism than in the others. So Confucianism is built on 5 virtues and 5 relationships. So once again, we see these repeating numbers coming back again. And I have the 5 relationships on the bottom left there, and I wanted to stress that these are really enduring. This concept of these 5 relationships and the patriarchal and top-down structures enforced by these 5 relationships are really key to understanding Asia. Like, why is Asia such a patriarchal place throughout its history? A lot of it comes back to the 5 relationships of Confucianism, many of which are reiterated across multiple other Chinese philosophies and the followers of Confucius who come later and modify Confucianism. So to go through the 5 relations in detail, we have 4 that are top down and 1 that is between equals. So the 4 that are top down are parent and child. The parent is above the child, and this stresses ideas like filial piety. The ruler and the minister, or the ruler and the subordinate, meaning the top is the person at the top and the bottom is the person at the bottom, and there's a ladder that you're climbing here in society. Husband and wife. So here we have a very obvious patriarchal structure, right? That husbands are above their wives. Elder and younger siblings. So if you have a brother or sister and you are older than them, you have more authority in that relationship and they should be respectful to you as an elder. And this means also respecting your elders in general is built into these relationships. Which is also, of course, built into parent and child. And then the 1 equal relationship is between 2 friends of equal standing. So you're about the same age, you probably have similar positions in society, and you should be honest and kind of fair to one another. This is the 5 relationships, 4 of which are top down and 1 of which is between equals. The Confucian beliefs, another set of 5 that I want to go through here, is that there are 5 Confucian virtues. These are very important because they are used throughout Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Southeast Asian, like Vietnamese, Thai, Cambodian history, to emphasize the way you should live your life. You should live with humaneness, or ren. Compassion, benevolence fall under this. With righteousness and justice, or yi, this is the moral right. There is a morality that you should adhere to. You should adhere to ritual, or li, the proper customs in social rituals. So this would be something like when your parents die, you should mourn them for a given period of time. Once every few years or once a year, you should hold specific rituals to mourn the dead. Those are particularly important. There might be one that happens after 5 years and one that happens after 10 years and other yearly ones as well. And you should adhere to these regardless of how they might disrupt your life. Knowledge, or je, understanding and familiarity with truths and principles, meaning you should seek knowledge, you should seek understanding, you should be a learned person. And integrity, shin, you should have honesty and morality within yourself. So these are very important concepts, and you might see when you're looking at something like the mandate of heaven and why a ruler might be seen as weak or strong, it might be because of their ability or inability to adhere to the ideals of something like Ren, their compassion for their people. That will be a reason given when someone needs to be overthrown or when someone's power is being affirmed by those around them. Their Ren is particularly good or bad, or their adherence to it is good or bad. And again, reiterating the point that these stay around for a long time, in 1890, when Japan was trying to become a quote-unquote modern nation and perhaps a westernized modern nation, this is after the abolition of the samurai, who you probably are familiar with, at least somewhat. In 1890, when they were creating an education system, even though they were trying to westernize and modernize, they decided to make their education system be built on the 5 relations and this set of ideals from Confucianism that was, in fact, 2,600, or I guess about 2,500 years old at that time. So these are very enduring ideas, and you still see them today in Chinese society, in East Asian and Southeast Asian society quite prominently. But Confucianism is not crystallized at the death of Confucius. The end of Confucius's life does not mean his ideas are set in stone. There are many students of Confucius, and in fact, a lot of the people we'll be talking about as Chinese philosophers in a Chinese philosophy course are in fact students of Confucius, who modify Confucianism in various ways and critique the original ideas of Confucius to try to create oftentimes a more practical or a more realistic, politically applicable version of his philosophy. I give you the links here to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for some of these, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is excellent because it gives really substantial entries on these people. This is the one for Confucius. This is the one for Lao Tzu, the Taoist, one of the Taoist founding figures, and also it talks about here whether or not Lao Tzu is a single person. And here we have legalism, another quite extensive essay, essentially. And these are good sources that you could use for papers if you want to study Chinese philosophy, any aspect of it, either comparatively or one school on its own for one of your papers. You could do that. And here I have an excerpt from that encyclopedia from Mencius, who is sometimes called the second sage, Confucius being the first sage, a sage being a very respected, wise person, especially in China. They are Chinese sages, and Mencius's beliefs are a little bit different than Confucius. Mencius believes and famously with Mencius, we see this analogy of a child falling into a well. That if someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well, anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because they sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because they wanted fame among one's neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. And from this we can see that if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not human. So Mencius is taking Confucianism and applying it to real life situations in important ways. And that human nature is, like Confucius said, essentially good. So if you're walking by and a child is about to fall in a well, any person who is a human being, who is not completely depraved, will go help that child, and not for any reward. They'll do it just to help the child. You may agree or disagree with this. This is the philosophical debate that we're seeing here, and we will see others today who do not agree with this statement. Here's one of them. Xunzi is another follower of Confucius, well, really of Mencius, who critiques Mencius, who disagrees with him on human nature. He says that humans seek profit and comfort. They're not good or bad, but they're just trying to live their lives as well as they can, as comfortably and well as they can, and that they'll do whatever they need to do to live that way. So in order to get people to live as good Confucian subjects, the state has to create this environment where following those Confucian virtues is beneficial to you, where it's just, the world we live in means it's good to be a good Confucian. And so we do see an evolution over time in Confucius's followers that is especially bent towards making Confucianism applicable to actual policy by the state. And so this is probably part of why, during the life of Confucius, Confucianism doesn't get very far. But a few hundred years later, and still a few hundred years after Xunzi, we see Confucianism take hold in the Han Dynasty, this 400 years that is really foundational to Chinese history. Even today, you will see the Han looked back at as the real golden age of old China. That Confucianism takes hold because of the followers of Confucius kind of hashing out what was the right way to actually apply Confucius's ideals to the real world. So my main point is that Confucianism is still evolving well after the death of its creator. And in terms of arguments, there's an A behind there, in pre-Qin philosophy, these are different schools. We have Mencius, people are good. Xunzi, people are just kind of seeking to live well. They're not really good or bad on their own. They're kind of a blank slate. And Han Feizi, who we'll get to in a minute, who thinks people are bad at their core and must be ironed out by the state. But first, we need to take a little break from these political applications and look at a little bit of Taoism. Because Taoism, as I said before, is harder to pin down than Confucianism or legalism. And I think a good illustration of this is to look at one of the most famous Taoist poems or tales from Chuangzi, who has a butterfly dream. And you can read about it here in detail, quite a bit of writing here about Chuangzi, who is more of an esoteric, a philosophical philosopher who is really considering the nature of reality and who we are as human beings. So Chuangzi said, "Once upon a time, I dreamed myself a butterfly, floating like petals in the air, happy to be doing as I pleased, no longer aware of myself. But soon enough, I awoke, and then frantically clutching myself, Chuangzi I was. I wonder, was Chuangzi dreaming himself the butterfly, or was the butterfly dreaming itself Chuangzi? Of course, if you take Shuangse and the butterfly together, then there's a difference between them. But that difference is only due to their changing material forms. So this is more about the nature of reality and who we are than about how to rule, right? And there's a lot of this also in Chinese philosophy, especially in Taoism. Here we have this wonderful painting. This is just a piece of modern art of Shuangse and the butterfly, and which is really the real Shuangse. I'm not going to go into depth on this, but I do want to talk about the precepts of Taoism, Shuangse being one of the foundational figures and Lao Tzu being the other really big foundational figure. And there are 10 precepts here. Do not kill or think depraved thoughts. Do not steal. Do not cheat. Don't get drunk. Maintain harmony with your ancestors. Help others who do good things. Help people who do good deeds, and support them with your joy and delight, as it says here. When you see someone unfortunate, help them, give them their dignity. When someone comes to do you harm, don't look for revenge against them. Let it go. And as long as all beings have not attained the Tao, the way, I will not expect to do so myself. So this is kind of a communal idea that everyone needs to find the way together or on their own, but they all need to find it. And this is from one translation on the 10 precepts of Taoism. We also see yin and yang, and here are some of their meanings, some of their elements to them. There's a feminine and masculine, a sun and a moon, lightness, heaviness, hardness, softness built in here. And there is a yin and yang in all things and all people, is part of what Taoism teaches. Lao Tzu is, as I said earlier, probably a combination of multiple people, multiple collaborators who create this figure to be their representative philosophical form, who is going to promote elements of Taoism that will function politically and also function more esoterically and more in terms of more abstract philosophy. And if you go to some universities in China, even some scholars in China maintain a rather strong opinion that Lao Tzu is a real person, a singular person. In the West, in most Chinese studies circles, Lao Tzu is considered to probably be multiple people. It's not really that important to this course, and I have not done any research into it myself. I'm merely telling you what I have been taught and what I have learned about Lao Tzu here. But when applied to governing, Lao Tzu's Taoism says that you should kind of advocate for Wu Wei, which is the art of doing nothing. What does that mean? Can you be a king if you do nothing and you just somehow are king? Well, Lao Tzu says yes. Lao Tzu says that most of the time, the actions of rulers, lawmakers, etc., end up complicating and hurting the lives of the people below them more than they help. And that people are better at governing themselves than at being governed from above. So Lao Tzu and the teachings of Lao Tzu say, as much as you can, don't act as a ruler. Now, this is naturally a hard one to implement, and it's part of why Taoism is more esoteric, more related to maybe a prototypical Chinese religion than the other Chinese philosophies, but it is still at its core also concerned with how to rule and how to control the world politically. And that's important to point out. Mohism is another one that is a little bit hard to hash out without a lot of background knowledge about early China, but Mohism is another Confucian, Mozi is another Confucian offshoot, and his thinking is seen as highly rational over ritual, Confucianism does have a lot of ritualistic behavior and ideas in it. So the adherence to ancient ritual and to the elders and to kind of beliefs that go back into the murky depths of prehistory. Confucius has a lot of that in his philosophy. Mozi throws a lot of that out. Mohism is essentially nonviolent. It says you should not have any kind of military aggression. You should not cause injury to others if you can help it. You should be frugal. You should not be wasteful or luxurious. You should have a central organized state, an authoritative state that has someone at the top who is benevolent and good. So this is a pretty significant difference between some of these others, is that the benevolence comes strictly from the top, and it should be merit-based. And although it will be hierarchical, it should really be rationally driven in its entirety. So even the king should be there strictly because he's capable. This does not go well with most kings because they want their sons and daughters to follow them, usually sons in China, as we've learned. But Mohism is still very significant because of its rationality. Although there is some worship of old ancient ghosts in heaven, generally speaking, there is less emphasis on ritual and more emphasis on just kind of respecting those who have died before you in this kind of folk religion, as it says here. And this is also from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And then the last one I'm going to talk about today, I'm going through these fairly quickly, as with all things in this course, but is Han-Feizi and legalism. Legalism is the first one that takes hold in a way that helps one ruler conquer all the other states. So in a way, legalism is the most successful, at least early on, although that state of Qin does not last for very long. It's really just one emperor. But Han-Feizi's legalist view is that people must be heavily regulated. And this is really harsh, hardcore control of the populace. The ruler leads, the people follow. People are naturally bad, they're evil, and prone to selfish deeds, so they must be controlled. They must be punished for the things that they do wrong, they must be punished when they are disloyal, and they must always follow the mandate of their ruler. So he also has some Confucianism within his beliefs, but he's a very, very strong realist. He believes in promoting strong government, and he's very extreme in the execution of the will of the state and its leaders. And this philosophy works very well for the Qin as they take over China, kind of with an iron fist. And Qin Shi Huangdi, the first empire of what would be a unified China, is the one who adopts this policy in its realist form. And so he is, a very tyrannical ruler, a very harsh ruler, and a very singular ruler, as we'll find out. So Qin Shi Huangdi, I'm sorry, it shouldn't say see page 55. That's an incorrect page number there, but that's okay. He's a unified and standardized China. So Qin may come from Qin Shi Huangdi and the Qin Empire. And his short legacy still survives today. So he's only really in power for 15 years, but there is a period of time before Qin Shi Huangdi of the Qin kind of consolidating power. We'll look at a map of that in a second. And here are some great videos for you to look at, some of them. We'll get to that in a minute. I'll show those again in a minute. But first I want to talk about Qin consolidation. This page number is right. So page 195, this is a good map of the Qin expanding their territory over time. And as I said before, Qin is one of the potential sources for the word China. It's not fully agreed on, but one of them. We see here an important development in the Great Wall. I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. And this kind of gradual acquisition of power, first in the West and then moving eastward and both northward and southward in the East. And So the Qin goes from this central core kingdom to all of China pretty quickly. I mean, this is uh, about 120, 130 years is all that it takes for the total conquest of what we will think of as China. Showing this just one more time, here's the full Qin dynasty on its own. You can see it encompasses the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Doesn't quite encompass the Pearl River yet, but a lot of what we think of today as kind of the main body of big Chinese cities is in here, and a lot of what is historically considered kind of the core of China is here in the Qin dynasty. As you can see, it's very short-lived here. It just gets this little dot before we go to the Han, which is a much later or much longer surviving dynasty. But it builds and it profits from the unity of the Qin. The Great Wall of China, here it is over time. I think this is a great kind of diagram, because the Great Wall of China should probably really be called the Great Walls of China's. And it is kind of built over time as a series of shorter segments of wall, and then later starts to be more uniform. But why build it? And the reason is that for virtually all of Chinese history, there are various steppe people, nomads from what is now Mongolia, far eastern Russia, the modern Mongolia and modern Far Eastern Russia, that are attempting to invade northern China. And they have various levels of success, also invading into Korea. And they have various levels of success over time, the most significant being the Mongols, who we'll talk about later in the term and who I've mentioned a few times. And the Great Wall is sometimes more effective than others. It was not very effective against the Mongols, but it was certainly there for a long period of time, and it had to have some useful effects to have been built and rebuilt like this, at keeping away probably some enemies we don't even know about, right? So the Great Wall of China was probably doing its best job keeping people out when we don't even know about those people today, which is the irony of the Great Wall of China. When it was working, we probably don't know it was working. And when it wasn't working, that's when we see that it wasn't working, because people invaded and got through. So the irony of the Great Wall. Moving right along here, I want to try not to keep this too long. Qin Shi Huangdi, this great first emperor of a unified China, inherits this fairly well-established Qin state and finishes up the expansion of China into the full size that we saw in that map from a couple slides earlier. And although he's very harsh, Qin Shi Huangdi's broad Chinese empire sets this precedent that survives today, that there should be this unified China, not all these little states, and standardized systems of rule. His legalist legacy creates a space for rule and order, but it is replaced by a more enduring Han legacy built on the Confucian order, mixed with a lot of the things that Qin Shi Huang did to set up China, creating districts, creating rules of measurement and weight, and kind of paving the way, creating this slate, not a blank slate, but this slate upon which the Chinese could draw their empire. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, here's a good video about it. I'm going to show you a few more. Well, it's a video and an article. This video is pretty good, pretty quick. And what you may be most familiar with are these terracotta warriors. I'll talk about them for a minute now, I guess. The terracotta warriors, and there are thousands of them. I think there are at least 8,000, but they just found 200 more earlier this year, so there could be more out there. Are quite interesting. They're life size. They're actually quite big for their time. These are big, strong guys who were there to defend Qin Shi Huang in his death, in the afterlife. And so Qin Shi Huang's tomb tells us a ton about the Chinese idea of the afterlife around the turn of the first millennium CE, or a little bit before it, but around 200 BCE. And These life-size armored figures were holding weapons, real weapons. You can see their hands are empty now, possibly because of grave robbers over time. Also, some of them may have decayed away, especially in the case of things like spears or pikes that would be made of wood handles. And very interestingly, the bodies were kind of mass-produced. There are a few different models that you see repeated over and over again. You can see these two here look to be roughly the same model of body, but the heads were different, and so were the hands. So the heads were modeled after the faces of real people, real guards of the emperor, and the hands were modified based on what they were doing, what kinds of weapons they were holding, or what other gear they had. And the belief was that in the afterlife, these figures would come to life along with terracotta horses, and some real horses were buried too. You have horse skeletons found in some of these tombs, which would be there to protect and serve and continue the empire of Qin Shi Huang after his death. This is something Qin Shi Huangdi really believes in. And he goes kind of off the deep end with towards the end of his life. He's famous for doing things like drinking tea that was infused with crushed jade, jade powder. This is not a good idea. It's not good for you. Drinking mercury, also a very bad idea. He may have died of mercury poisoning. Some people theorize this. The belief being that these were permanent, lasting materials that would give you longer life, or perhaps a never-ending life. You'd be able to escape death by drinking and eating these things. But as a backup plan, he also had this huge tomb built while he was alive. This tomb is my favorite, in part because it's more than just a tomb. It's more than just a pyramid. And so are many of the others that we've looked at this term, but this one in particular is huge. It has a lot of things going on. But the mound of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, we can compare it to other structures. It's not as big as the pyramids. Here we have some interesting things like the hotel that's being constructed in Pyongyang, the Shard in London, Transamerica Pyramid. But here we get to some early things. The Great Pyramid of Giza gets the honor of being the tallest one, the biggest one of these early pyramid structures. We have the Luxor in Las Vegas, the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid. These are all Egyptian pyramid tombs. This is a collapsed pyramid at Meidum. And then here's Qin Shi Huang's. And you can see that it's quite wide, but still quite tall. I mean, it's not quite as tall as the Pyramid of Giza, but it's pretty big. It's pretty close. And it's this big, wide structure. Maybe a little bit more similar in its structure to the Great Pyramid of Cholula in Mexico, which is another one of these wider pyramids. Anyway, you can imagine that these would all be very difficult to build, and the reason Qin Shi Huang is my favorite is not because it's like bigger or anything like that. It is in fact, roughly similar in size to some of these other pyramid structures. But it is a great pyramid of Qin Shi Huang, his mausoleum, surrounded by a whole city, and even further out, armies that are buried in the hills around it. So the terracotta army that's quite famous, that you know probably already, is actually about a mile away from the rest of the tomb. And there are probably others, other chunks of this that we have not even found yet, buried around this tomb. And so the discovery of these things is ongoing. And it's like back in the 60s or 70s, they first started finding these terracotta warriors a mile away from the tomb. And so this is very surprising. I'm going to play this video in the background. I think I can turn on the captions as well. We have some very interesting things going on inside the tomb itself, which is this packed earth burial structure. It's also partially underground. You can see here that it extends into the earth. And within it is Qin Shi Huang's tomb. It has not been fully excavated. The Chinese government doesn't want to excavate it fully because, well, one of the scientific reasons is that as they've been uncovering the terracotta warriors, a lot of what they find falls apart really quickly when it's exposed to air. So these are like hermetically sealed tombs. And so the Chinese government says that they want to wait for science to go get along a little bit further so that they could hermetically seal it as they dig it up. That's the way they would want to get to the tomb of the first emperor. This is a demonstration of some really old tombs in China, ancient, probably Shang and Zhou period tombs, like the ones we looked at in week 2. And they got bigger and more elaborate over time. Often we see things like weapons, horses, and the burials of other human beings. Qin Shi Huangdi famously probably buried the architects of his tomb and those who constructed it with him so that no one would be able to find it. And I'm going to pause this here. Here we have a really nice image of what it looks like now. You can see it's overgrown with trees, but it's this large man-made pyramid on a hill kind of a thing that is buried into the ground. And you can't see much of it from the outside. It's not as striking as the pyramids of Giza, for example, which don't have these trees all over them. But it's more the broader structure that I think is really fascinating. And then when you go inside the tomb, which we're going to do now, rumor has it, and there is some science to back this up, that the innermost chamber of Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb has a map of his empire built of things like gold and other precious metals and jade, with rivers of flowing mercury that were put there when Qin Shi Huang was entombed. This has long been something that people have debated, like did they have access to this much flowing liquid mercury or not? It's possible that they did. Mercury comes in steam off of the production of other metals, and China did have access to large mines. I believe I've given you some of the science here to look at. And here is a podcast you can listen to if you're very interested in this. It's about 13 minutes long. That's kind of built around this idea of the mercury rivers in Qin Shi Huang's tomb and whether or not this is a realistic thing. Letting this go a little bit more, this map of the empire with Qin Shi Huang's tomb in the middle, and Qin Shi Huang probably buried with a number of kind of priceless artifacts and other very useful things in the afterlife, probably food, maybe other people with him, maybe some more terracotta figures in there. It would not at all be surprising, right? Because if he believes that this army over here can help him, there may be other figures there with him, servants, concubines, wives, other family members may be in there with him. And we also see some very interesting things here labeled like slaughter pits, mutilated skeletons, probably ministers who Qin Shi Huangdi killed when he ascended the throne because he was a very paranoid person, and he did turn on a lot of the people around him. So before we get to next time, Qin Shi Huangdi ruled in this legalistic way under the beliefs of people like Han Feizi. He had harsh punishments laid out for the crimes of those in his empire and harsh rules for life, including, essentially the veneration of the emperor above all others. And we see a lot of really harsh punishments for crimes, the invention of things like drawing and quartering, which I think I mentioned in one of your classes in the second or third lecture when we were actually still in person. But things like drawing and quartering were actually invented by Qin Shi Huang's empire to keep people in line. These public executions go on. So a very harsh ruler, but at the same time, his empire is very important because it paves this way for the Han, who you read about in your textbook. I'm going to go ahead and stop this lecture here. Hopefully this has been helpful in understanding Chinese philosophy. We don't have another lecture this week, as I already said, and the spring recess is coming up next. So happy spring break, spring recess to you. I hope you have a good week off, week and a half off, And in week 7, I will see you back again on the 21st with our class museum. So one thing I want you to do for that is please submit a photo of your object and a short description of it to me by the 19th. You can go ahead and do that earlier if you want, that's fine. I just want to go ahead and assemble that kind of lecture, and I can't do it without your pictures. So if you don't get it to me by the 19th, your picture and your object might not make it into our class. Also due on the 21st is your third short response, Classical Chinese Philosophy and Statecraft, which I'm going to have up here before the spring recess around the time of this lecture, so you can go ahead and get it done before the recess if you'd like. That way you don't have it hanging over your head. And then we'll get to Islam also in the week that we get back. And yeah, so you should be working on your object papers. Those should be coming along now. And if you feel like you need to catch up, that is something you can work on here this week and maybe right after the recess or during the recess if you really have to. All right, everybody. Have a good break, and I will see you in 2 weeks.